Thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Bernardo Escalona. I work for a company called D&B Audio Technik, and our business is building loudspeakers and amplifiers. But we also offer an increasing number of software solutions. Now, it's my first time presenting here at the ADC, but I've been here 4 times already, so I'm one of the 30 people. And I've noticed there's a large focus at the ADC in software development for music production, which is very interesting. But I'm here to tell you that there's also a lot of interesting, exciting software that takes place once our precious audio signal has left the mixing console. So one of the coolest ways to experience music is live. But there's a lot of challenges involved in planning and mounting and delivering a live event with a sound reinforcement system. So this talk will not be an in-depth talk about one specific subject, but more of an overview over a range of subjects. At D&B, we specialize in line arrays, so that's also what the focus of this talk is going to be. Now, during the last decade or so, there has been a lot of advances in the software tools available for the design and simulation of a sound reinforcement system, in setting up the system at the venue, and ultimately to deliver the best event, to improve the listening experience of our audience. Originally, I was planning to talk about all 3 topics in this today, but unfortunately it turned out to be too much material for 25 minutes, so today I'm only going to focus on the design and simulation part. And if it goes well, maybe you'll see me next year. So one of the pioneers in line array theory, Stefan Feisel, said line arrays are advanced loudspeaker systems. They're flexible, powerful, but complex to handle. And just so everybody's on the same boat, this is a line array, right? And I wanted to throw his name on the slide, just so that if you want to do any further reading afterwards. Now, one of the ultimate goals of a live sound system engineer is to provide the best quality of sound to everybody in the audience, right? This is not always a trivial task, considering all the varying factors, like, for example, varying distances from the different listeners to our loudspeakers, interactions between the loudspeakers, the effects of the room itself, the musicians, air absorption, and so on. Now, in the old days, or sometimes even nowadays, you would have to run around the venue with a microphone measuring and tuning up the system at the venue, probably on the day of the event. As the algorithms and the tools evolve, we can rely more and more on software to do the simulation beforehand and from the comfort of our home. Now, we all know this picture. If we throw a rock in a pond, it will create a circular wave which expands from the center. As time goes on and the energy of the wave gets spread over a larger circle, the amount of energy at one specific point becomes less and less, right? The same that is true in 2 dimensions is true in 3 dimensions. So as the sound propagates from a loudspeaker, it creates a spherical wave that expands from the center. So let me throw an equation at you. So this is how the complex sound pressure is calculated at a specific point source at frequency f and distance vector r. So r is the distance between the source and the listening point that we're interested in. And we already see from this equation that it's at the bottom of the equation, so it's inversely proportional to a resulting sound pressure. Makes sense, right? Like the wave in the water, as the distance increases, the energy at a specific point decreases. A is the complex frequency response, or the amplitude. So think about the signal spectrum is complex, has a phase and a magnitude at every frequency. The exponential term is how the phase of the wave behaves at the specific distance. And D is the directivity. Now, this is something new, isn't it? When a sound source, a theoretical sound source, is much smaller than the wavelength it produces, we can imagine it as an ideal point source which creates a perfect spherical wavefront, expanding front middle. Now the wavefront of a real loudspeaker is not quite as perfect sphere. It's a bit more complicated than that. So these images are top views from representations we call balloons. And as you can see, the shape of the wavefront is not only frequency dependent, but it's also angle dependent relative to the main axis of the loudspeaker. So if you look at the bottom right, this loudspeaker has a high directivity at 10 kilohertz to the front and a little bit to the side, but not so much to the back. And you notice here, the deeper the frequency, the lower the frequency, or in other words, the bigger the wavelength, in relative to the sound of the loudspeaker, the closer we approach this ideal point source that I talked about, which creates a perfect sphere. So you see at 100 hertz. Now there are computational methods that can be used to approximate these balloons based on the properties of a loudspeaker. However, still today, the most accurate method, even though it's the most time consuming, is just to measure the loudspeaker. So the loudspeaker is mounted on a robotic arm inside an anechoic chamber with one or more microphones. Sweep signal is played, frequency response is measured, and then the loudspeaker is rotated by some amount. Repeat until you get the complete sphere, or at least 1/2 or 1/4 of it, depending on whether you expect the balloon to be symmetrical. So that's how we obtain the term D in our equation for the sound pressure of a single point source. However, line arrays are not composed of just one single point source, but rather several. Sometimes actually quite a few. So how do we go from a single point source to a complete line array? Well, according to what we call the complex directivity point source model, or CDPS, we just sum up all the point sources. Now, the sound engineer who designed the system for this church in South Korea didn't need to know the complex directivity point source model to check if everybody can hear the sermon. Of course not. He has software tools that does it for him. Example, one of the useful visual aids that we can use to approximate the frequency distribution of our system is the level over distance plot along the main axis of the line array. In this example, the signal at 1 kilohertz, the level starts at about 110 dB. I hope you can read it. And closest to the line array, and it drops off more or less uniformly till about 92 dB at 120 meters at the back. So again, like the wave in the water, as the distance increases, the level decreases. Notice the little hump at around 40 meters. I'll come to that a bit later. Another visual aid that is useful is the SPL mapping. So this is a top view of our audience area, or what we call the listening plane, where the color represents the level of the sound pressure. So the red is the most intense at the front next to the line array, and blue and purple is the lowest. And you can see we can even identify the little bump around 40 meters. Here's the same line array at 2 kilohertz. So you notice, I hope you can see the dark line is what we had at 1 kilohertz. And now it's a little bit lower, nothing wrong with that. But you've noticed the hump has now wandered to about 55 meters. And finally, we have the same thing at 4 kilohertz. And now the little bump has moved to about 70 meters away from the main array. So where are all these humps and ripples coming from, and why do they keep moving from frequency to frequency. Well, these are the interactions between the individual loudspeakers in our line array. They are the result of our complex summation from the CDPS model that we saw in the equation before. And it turns out that it's not just a mathematical model, but it's actually quite an accurate approximation. If you were to walk out there across the field, you would actually hear these bumps coming and going. Now, I said at the beginning that one of the tasks of a live sound engineer is to provide everybody with homogeneous frequency response. Now, if these bumps are moving around in frequency and place, now I'm not providing everybody with the same mix, am I? So that's one of the tasks, to try to minimize these differences. Luckily, having tools to simulate the SPL and immediately see the results can be very useful instead of having to do it at the venue and having to measure every time. Here, for example, I have only adjusted the angle between the display links of a few of the loudspeakers. If you look on the left side, you can see the shape changing slightly, and you can immediately see what the effect is expected in the SPL over distance at the main axis. So in my version here, I managed to flatten the bump that we had at about 50 meters, but I've introduced a new one at 30 meters. So what can I say? I'm not very good at this. I'm a software developer, not a sound engineer. The value of these software tools and software algorithms becomes even more obvious when we're dealing with complex or large sound reinforcement systems, and the requirement that they are accurate becomes even more emphasized. Now, talking about complex sound reinforcement systems, they're not usually just composed of the one line array. They usually have several elements. For example, here at this concert, we have a main array left and right, and also a subwoofer array. Now, the people standing at the first row, you will notice their distance to the subwoofer array is much shorter than to the main array. Imagine the sound of the drummer's kick drum coming out of both systems at the same time and arriving at the first row at different arrival times due to a different distance. Instead of having a kick drum that is snappy and crisp, it will be a bit spread and mushy. So to achieve equal arrival times, we have rule of thumb. You can compensate for a delta x distance factor, dividing by the speed of sound, and you just get delta t is the delay that you would have to introduce, the artificial delay we have to introduce, in this case, at the subwoofer. Now, this is how you would typically do it. Now, of course, you have tools that do it for you more accurately. And when time aligning with the subwoofer array, the low frequencies are especially relevant, like, for example, the kick drum, right? Now, this plot that I have here of phase over distance is what is simulated at one particular point, which is very important. When it comes to time alignment, there is no perfect alignment for everybody. You have to pick a point where you think most of the audience will benefit from it, and everything else is a compromise. So here we have phase over frequency, and you see the white line is the signal, the phase of the subwoofer array, and the blue line is from the main array, and you see that at about 100 hertz, they're pretty much out of phase, almost 180 degrees apart, so this will not sound very good. If we introduce an artificial delay at the amplifiers of the subwoofer array, we can compensate for this and align the two frequencies. Now, the window of frequencies that is relevant for this alignment will depend on the crossover, the crossover overlapping frequencies of the both systems, right? Now, whenever side fill arrays, so-called, are needed, like for example in this arena where you have sitting areas in the side of the stage, a similar alignment is required, especially for the areas of the audience where systems overlap. So this on the left is the top view of both arrays, so the area where where the people can hear both arrays, that's the most relevant for time alignment. And again, there's no perfect alignment for everybody, for a compromise. So if I was to plot the pressure level over time at this specific test point, you can see that the signal from the blue array is arriving about 5 milliseconds before the signal from the yellow array, just due to the distance difference. Now, this might be something you want to compensate. In this particular example, it doesn't matter because the level difference is just so big. You can see the signal from the blue array is more about 10 dB louder than the yellow array, so it's going to mask the yellow array. So the people sitting there won't even hear it, the yellow signal. So in this case, it doesn't matter, but just as an example. Now, so far, I've only talked about on-site simulation. We want to provide the best sound possible to the people inside our venue. They paid to be there. For them, this is art. But what about the next-door neighbor who has to get up in the morning to go to work? For them, this is unwanted noise. So we have the two sides of the coin. Emission is the beautiful music coming out of our loudspeakers. And emission is what's creeping into the unwanted areas, right? Now, there is software that can be used to forecast or predict emission. Emission has a negative connotation and is usually used when talking about environmental noise due to industry or traffic, right? But the software used for those kinds of predictions up to now has not considered the coherent nature of music coming out of a sound system, right? So if you think about traffic, if you measure the noise coming out of 2 cars or 2 fans in a factory or something, it's incoherent noise. So when you measure it from at the same distance, it will add up to 3 dB. But things are different when you talk about signal coming from 2 loudspeakers that are playing a correlated signal. So it will depend on your listening point, right? You might have complete cancellation at some point, or you might have complete summation up to 6 dB. So this has to be kind of fed into the existing noise emission software if you want to forecast what the noise emission is going to be due to an open air event, for example. You also feed it, of course, terrain data. So for mapping and elevation information, this can come from sources such as Google Earth, for example. You need to feed it the weather conditions. So air, temperature, humidity makes a big difference, and wind, of course. Any reflective, absorbent, or mitigation areas need to be usually marked manually because that level of detail is not present in the terrain data. So in this example, we've marked the buildings as reflective, and you might want to mark the forest at the bottom, like absorbent area. There are standardized methods for calculating the emission noise. One of them is ISO 9613-2, which is a very well established standard, but it always assumes a worst-case wind scenario, so it might not be as accurate or realistic for an open-air event, which is taking place on just one weekend. And the other one is the NOR 2000, which is a bit more realistic, but not as widespread yet. And having such a forecast is important, especially when you think about the local authorities which demand such a thing to be, and before you can issue a permit for your open air event, right? So essentially, whatever offsite emission limitations you have, or regulations, that is going to be what will limit your on-site SPL limits. So what did I talk about today? I talked about some of the challenges involved in the design and simulation of sound reinforcement systems and how software can be used to overcome them. First of all, the complex directivity point source model that I talked about, the equation that I showed you, talked about directivity, so that part of the equation which takes care of the directivity part. Some visual aids that can be used or simulated to optimize such a sound reinforcement system, like for example the SPL over distance or SPL mapping. I talked about why time alignment is important and how you can compensate for it. And finally, how all of this can be used to make a larger scale forecast of a sound system. So that's all for me today. Hope you found it interesting. Thank you for listening.
I think we have 3-4 minutes for questions, and then we're into lunch break. I don't know what the...
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Question about time alignment. Are you aligning the whole speaker every time, or would you also align different bands, so using an equalizer for each signal when you compensate on the signal from the different speakers?
So the artificial delay that you introduce is absolute, so it's not frequency dependent, right?
Okay, so you would delay the whole signal for each individual speaker,
so you pick
equalizing or anything.
Yeah, so you pick a frequency range that is most relevant, which, for example, for the subwoofer array was about 100 hertz, and you pick that, and that's going to be your absolute delay.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That answers my follow-up question, because I would have asked if the phase differences in different after equalizing would make a problem, because if you were to delay certain parts of the signal, for instance, because you want to bend the different. Sorry, hard to explain.
Yeah, so the frequency-based delaying is mostly used more for beam steering. Mm-hmm. So that's a complete different talk. Okay. That's also didn't talk about this today, but that's mostly what it's used for. It's not really used for time alignment.
Yeah,
but more for
thanks. Yeah, that was what I was going to.
Yeah.
We've got time for one question.
It's a 2-in-1 question. So you mentioned that there's a lot of software that you can use to simulate this stuff from the comfort of your own home. So when you are going into a venue, do you get a full 3D architect diagram with all the little sound absorbing fins? And I guess my second question that builds on that is, are spaces set up generally for anyone to come in and play, or do folks have to come in for a violin concerto versus a rock show? And then is there some other thing that has to happen?
Okay, for the first question, that's actually quite interesting. Also, we're actually working on a venue database, which can be part of the software. So if there's some famous venues that are available, or people have already measured them, so they're kind of available as kind of like a CAT file or something like that, we're actually working on that. But as far as I know, it usually goes from either you measure yourself and create the venue and the software yourself, or you have to know the right people to get the files from a specific venue. So that's it's not always easy to get a hands of. So a lot of people just kind of measure and approximate themselves what the listening areas are about. But like I said, with the venue database that we're working on, could be a lot easier. And the second part of the question, sorry, can you repeat it?
Yeah, just in terms of the actual music that's being played, is
the
there
type of music, yeah. I'm actually not the expert in this, but definitely the build-up of your sound system is going to vary. Like, for example, the picture I showed with the whole subwoofer arrays, that's very rock-oriented music that you need that for. Of course, if you have like a classic concert, you don't need as many subwoofers. Instead, what is more common is having an array of point sources around the audience to create, for example, simulate reverb and room when it's an open air classic event, for example. So that's a completely different beast, right? It also has to be simulated in a similar way, but the way you design the sound system is completely different. So yeah, it totally depends on the material, absolutely, yeah.
I think that's our time. If you want to ask questions, I'm sure Bernardo will be happy to answer them over lunch.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bernardo.
Thank you.